So once you start talking about through the Son, it isn't the filioque anymore. I understand that Florence used from and through, but if you read the Florentine statements, they were very careful to claim and to state that through is to be understood in terms of from and not necessarily vice versa. So it is still maintaining hypostatic origination. Then we get into all the Clarkian whacknut stuff of essentially Berkeleyan idealism. Shelton argues that if God is a set, that God is a set of propositions. This is what he claims. But the problem is, if God is a set of propositions, what unifies the propositions that is God? Is there some God above God that kind of holds them all together? Is some fourth essence or something? Something that is not an idea, that's a mind? We need a principle of unity here, and this is just creating more problems than it solves. It's just really bad philosophy. Then he argues that the attributes are ideas in the minds of God. The problem is that attributes aren't property. Attributes are things that get predicated. They're the things that get said and uttered. So we need to get clear that attributes are not necessarily properties. But putting that aside, if the attributes are ideas in God's mind, why aren't I, as an idea in the mind of God, an attribute, a divine attribute too? Then Shelton claims that God is a monism. Well, monism is a thesis, not a thing. I think he means to say that God is a monad. Fine, God is a monad. But if God is a monad, then the distinctions that he's claiming are in God must be in how we think about the monad, or otherwise it isn't an absolute unity of the monad. Here Shelton seems to contradict himself. If the idea that I'm an accident, in God's mind, then God either has accidents, because Shelton's now claiming that I'm an accident in God's mind. Then either God has accidents qua essence, he has them essentially, and then therefore there are parts that God can gain and lose, or there are ideas that God has which are not eternal ideas, and hence I am not one of them. If so, then I am a new idea, and God has learned something. All of this is very, very bad. If God has accidental qualities, essentially, that is of his essence, then God is composite. And you've already given up the doctrine of simplicity by anybody's measure. Nobody says that God has accidental qualities. No tradition I know maintains this. This is just really bad. He tries to defend his position by arguing that, by analogy, that just as contents in my own mind do not define me essentially, such can be the case in God. The problem is you are composite and not simple, and this is why the contents of your mind do not necessarily define you. Also, the mind isn't the person anyway. Jesus had a human mind and a human soul, but he wasn't a human person. So the analogy, the argument from analogy is a weak one because it only holds if we maintain that God is composite. But he rejects that God is composite, and therefore it's a weak analogy. It's a bad argument. Then Shelton argues that there are two ideas of God, that God has of me. So there are two ideas that God has of me. Well, here we're moving from a monadology, in that God is a single monad, to a more Leibnizian monadology. So there are two ideas that God has of me, one ad intra and one ad extra. Well, here's the problem. Which one is me? Further, if the ad intra one is eternal, then why isn't it God or deity if God is simple? Certainly not a part, because God simply has no parts. If I am, on the other hand, the temporal copy of the idea in God's mind, what is added to my idea, qua eternality, to make it exist in the temporal world? It can't be matter, since Shelton, like Clark, doesn't believe there is such a thing as matter. It can't be being or existence, since that would commit one to thinking that the ideas of me ad intra in God doesn't exist. So what is added to make it exist in the temporal realm? Further, and how do the eternal thoughts come into temporality if the temporal realm is an idea in God's mind as well? The one just collapses right back into the other. If you're going to be an idealist, don't talk about the temporal realm. The temporal realm is no different than the mental or ideal realm. That's what idealism means. The ideal is the real. So here Shelton just seems to be really confused and inconsistent. Then he argues against the Orthodox view of the Trinity by creating a straw man. His straw man is that the essence is some separate unknown substance. But no Orthodox writer takes the divine essence to be, first, a separate substance, and second, a separate substance in Aristotle's first or second sense. Here's part of the problem. Shelton doesn't understand that in the Orthodox view of the Trinity, the persons are also hyperousia. They are also beyond being. But they reveal themselves through being, through their energies, through their activities. So they act like a middle term in manifesting the essential divine power, which comes to act. Alright? So it is their activities. So the revealing activity isn't exhaustive of them, and this is also true with other agents, non-divine agents. Observing my behavior will not tell you everything about me, and this is because persons, strictly speaking, are not objects like any other kind of object. They can't be reduced to some set of properties, which can then be analyzed and explained in terms of principles or laws. This is why there are no laws in psychology. It's not just because we're not good enough observers. Then we get the usual complaint, the Clarkian complaint of the anything Aristotelian is heretical, satanic, yada yada yada. And so he's going to reject the Aristotelian categories used in understanding the Trinity. But the problem is that if he's going to reject the Aristotelian categories of understanding the Trinity, then he had better reject the Aristotelian category of relation, which is necessary in his quasi-Augustinian view of the Trinity. So here he seems entirely inconsistent. So then Shelton says that the divine persons are attributes. Full stop. This is just crazy. This walks entirely right into the line of argumentation that Farrell says that he's committed to. They're confusing person and nature. Persons are not attributes. They are not properties. They're something else. So if they are divine ideas in God's mind, then Shelton has just made his own position susceptible to the same criticism of a quaternity, since now the mind that does the thinking isn't the persons, but some fourth agent-like thing which is behind the persons. So here he's inconsistent again. Then Shelton rejects the eternal generation of the Son and then runs to Augustine to hold out the possibility of making sense of the Trinity, except that Augustine's model is built with the eternal generation of the Son in mind, and it is in no wise obvious that one can extract the doctrine of eternal generation of the Son from Augustine's triadology without fundamentally altering it, that is, making it non-Augustinian. Then he seems to make an implicit argument that the Orthodox view of God can't explain why God hates sin, because we supposedly claim it is an essential. But our view doesn't deny that God's hatred of sin is essential to him insofar as it is natural for him to do so. But there's no inference from the possession of a power to its necessary actualization. And even if we were to say that God eternally hates evil, that is, eternally active in doing so, this only picks out a timeless activity on God's part. It doesn't imply that the action is unfree. The problem here is that people often assume that successive iteration of moments is a necessary condition for free activity. It's not. As for not explaining why God hates evil, that might be a problem if we had a demonstration on hand from Shelton showing that we needed an explanation for these kinds of things in God, that we could analyze God like that. But he hasn't given us that kind of demonstration, so there's really no need to answer that objection. So have a nice day.